last video was a little longer than planned. I got a little excited to talk about Algonquins and the new power structure relations with Jamestown. But I want to answer this question and at least look at this question of how Jamestown and these colonies in the early 18th century, so the very beginning of the 1700s, the late 1600s, how did they get such amazing population growth? So slaves, indentured servitude, but also another group that we have to look at the Mayflower, these Puritans, and what's happening there. We're going to look at the Navigation Act, and really I want to just very briefly look at the story of popular image in history when it was often ties to the idea of Thanksgiving, and that's this very complex character that we know as Squanto. And what the real story is. So I just, within 15 minutes, this video, I just want to be able to touch on these concepts to help bring that into what you're reading in chapter 3 and 4. One part in these northern colonies in these Americas that England tries to do is to try to create control over making sure all the money through this mercantile system is benefiting the country itself, benefiting the crown. So they install what's known as Navigation Acts that you read about. There's one 1650, 51, 60, 63. Even in the 1700s, you see this idea of Navigation Acts really being a central theme of colonial power, of overseeing the colonial power, making sure the British crown has their hand in everything that's happening in these American colonial power, okay? So you have goods that are shipped to and from the colonies, have to be on English ships, has to be English crew, has to be colonial products, have to be shipped first to England before they go anywhere else. And what's the point of all that? Taxes. Everything's able to be taxed. Even if something from the colonies was going to go to Africa directly, for example, to West Africa, to Ghana, it had to first go to England, then it was taxed there, put on different ships, and then sent to Africa. So it's really making sure that triangle trade is happening. But why? So that there's always a chance for money to be taxed and be able to go to the crown. So the Navigation Act's huge. Back on these colonies, with these crops, how do you have a growing industry of these monocrops coming about, and how do you fulfill it with labor? Well, one is with slaves that we're going to talk in the next video. But another way that the crown was starting to import itself more. And remember the royal colony. Remember in Jamestown when it comes under the control of the crown, and some other colonies as well. Georgia, for example. These places become the direct control of the crown. And one way to fix the problem of overpopulation in cities and in England, and also the labor crisis that's happening in these colonies, is through indentured labor, of people who are poor being sent over, returned 5-7 years that we talked about. That's a big part. But also king's passengers, convicts, right? These are, instead of having them fill the jails up in England, why don't we send them over to these colonies? So Georgia becomes this convict colony. Send them over to Americas. Send them there. They could help the crisis of labor. And maybe it'll help their personality too. Maybe the weather being warmer will help them civilize them. Maybe it'll help them not be so aggressive as they were in the foggy English towns. So Transportation Act of 1718 allows England to send imprisoned convicts to be sold. So treated as slaves themselves, actually. And that money being taxed and going to the crown, but also to very keen investors. So the king's passengers becomes a new way that people are coming into this land. Now that is it happens throughout the 1700s, and it is hit with a lot of criticism by these colonial elites, and especially on the eve of the Revolutionary War. In fact, if you're in Northern California, you might see this flag. I know a lot of this emblem, this idea of the Jefferson State. And on that flag, what's that flag? The Don't Tread on Me snake there. That is the Gadsden flag. You might have seen this. The original idea of that snake on that flag that was used in the Revolutionary War, but before that was connected to this idea of the king's passengers. And it was an argument made by Benjamin Franklin himself in fighting against this idea of sending all of England's convicts to the colonies. And this is later. This is on the 1750s and 60s, on the eve of the Revolutionary War in the 1770s. Benjamin Franklin writes, "In some of the uninhabited parts of these provinces," talking about the colonies, "there are a number of these venomous reptiles we call rattlesnakes. They are felon convicts." They're convicts. There are convicts in the colonies, right? From the beginning of the world, right? So the beginning of the world, Adam and Eve, who was their biggest convict? That would be that snake that tempted Eve. Well, there you go. So these, whenever we meet them, we put them to death. By virtue of an old law, thou shalt bruise his head. But it's being funny. But as this is a law and may seem too cruel, and as, however mischievous these creatures, these snakes, are to us, they may possibly change their nature. That was the argument of these convicts in England coming over to the colonies, saying they might change their nature if they're in a different climate or if they're in a different environment. Benjamin Franklin saying the same in reverse. If we send over our rattlesnakes to England, our convicts, maybe it'll change their nature. If they were to change the climate, I would humbly propose that this general sentence of death be put to transportation. So instead of us killing these snakes, maybe they could be made virtuous by a change of climate with a different environment. We'll send our rattlesnakes back to you, King George, is what Franklin's saying. So that's his argument against these king's passengers, against this idea of convicts coming over that are filling the population with rapists and murderers and all these things, just like a bad rattlesnake. Let's send them ours, and you can see what the good will do there. So the very foundation of that is, don't tread on me, England. Don't tread on me, King George. And it became a sign of the Revolutionary War, didn't it? So this whole concept and crisis of these convicts coming over builds on its imagery into the very start of the Revolutionary War. Now, to switch gears, and I'll do this very quickly, I want to talk about the imagery that you have with the Mayflower Compact, where the Mayflower lands, with these Puritans. Now, they were supposed to be in Virginia. They get lost, and they end up somewhere else, what we call as Plymouth. They meet Massasoit and Squanto, and the popular story is they exchange, all kinds of corn and goods. They have a big Thanksgiving dinner and they pray, and it's a beautiful thing. Now, in reality, there's an interesting power struggle happening. Just like Powhatan and his Algonquin, you have Massasoit and the Wampanoag, right? Wampanoag people are still around today. This is from their website. And he's the leader of this large Wampanoag empire, this group of people. Now, Squanto is a bridge between these two. As this new colony arrives with Mayflower, with Plymouth and these new Puritans in this new region, Squanto sees an opportunity, and this is a smart, important thing of the complexity of the Native American people in this story. So the true story of Squanto is a lot more interesting and complex than the very superficial story you often get with Squanto and the first Thanksgiving. That's interesting. Now, Squanto was seen as the bridge between these two societies, largely because of his background. Now, Squanto, a series of unfortunate events led to Squanto's life, but in 1605, he was kidnapped by privateers and was brought over to England for 9 years. He's returned briefly, but then he was recaptured again by the Spanish, sold as a slave, rescued by friars. So you can kind of see the lines here. He was then finally rescued by friars. He made his way back to England, and then he was recaptured there, sent back to England, and then returned back to Massachusetts and his peoples, only to find that his village has been completely killed by a plague that hit. So he survived. Remember, you don't even have to have Europeans in an area. Once that started to happen in the 1600s of European interaction, between zoonotic diseases and everything else, plagues started to spread across the Americas. And so for no apparent reason, you'd see areas completely wiped out. And that's what happened with Squanto's village. Now here's a new opportunity. That was in 1619. Shortly thereafter, he came upon this new peoples who were coming in, these Puritans in Plymouth, and had an opportunity. So he, because of his situation, 9 years in England and also in Spain, he spoke English. Now, could you imagine? Here's these Puritans. They understand and hear stories of Jamestown and all this, of everything that's happening. And here comes this Indian who walks up to them. And what does he say? He doesn't say how, please. He says, hi, how's it going? He speaks their language. Must have freaked them out. And so he was able to be a bridge between these new arrivals and also the main chief, Massasoit, who saw these foreign invaders. And they didn't understand. Squanto had power and information. He understood these people. He knew them as people. They weren't as gods. He knew that they were just as conniving, scheming as his own people. He understood the fears that they had. He understood the fears that these Indian people had of them. So what he did, yes, he helped work with Massasoit and to create communication, gave them some food and goods and taught them how to grow some things like the story is. But more importantly, what he did is he traveled from village to village under the control of Massasoit. And he told these people about European power. He said, yeah, they're like gods. They have amazing weapons. But they're very cruel. They will kill you as quick as look at you. So you got to watch out. I know their ways. I lived with these people. They know me. So look to me, as he would tell the villagers. He would say, look to me and understand what's going on. And doing so, he said, you know what? If they're gonna kill you, but if they won't kill you if you give them all your gold. They like gold. If you give them gold, if you give precious resources, they'll be happy and they won't kill you. So he starts collecting tribute. He starts collecting tribute from all these Indian villages. Does he give them to Massasoit? Does he give them to these Puritans? No, they had no idea this was going on. It was for his own wealth. So he's going to village, telling them about stories of these white people who are there, how horrible they are. The only way to survive is to give tribute, and Squanto's picking up the wealth this way. Now, he gets a little too far with this when he tries to convince the villagers not only to trust him, but to also trust him over Massasoit. And he starts to feel like this is an opportunity for him to overthrow Massasoit. So he goes village to village. Don't trust in Massasoit. Trust in me. I'm the one that's saving you against these Europeans that are coming in, not Massasoit. And then he starts to build a base. He starts to build this power structure over Massasoit. He goes too far when he goes to Plymouth. He goes to the Puritans and says, you know what, Massasoit, he's trying to kill you. He's going to overthrow you. He is going to wipe you out. You've heard stories of the Algonquins wiping out their colonial settlers in their region. Massasoit's going to do the same thing. They were smart. The Puritans said, that doesn't seem like the relations we've been having here. So another middle person, another person who's starting to learn the language at the time, one of the colonialists, and working with Massasoit directly, goes to Massasoit and asks him, is that true? This is what Squanto says. Squanto says you're trying to overthrow us. Real quickly, both sides realize that Squanto's gain here, what he's trying to do. And there's conflicting stories of how Squanto dies. A lot of people say Massasoit killed him. Some people say he died from a disease. Either way, it was right after the situation occurred, this political structure. So it's no real wonder that he might have been killed by either Massasoit, his leader, or by the colonists who saw him as a threat. An interesting real story showing the complexity of what's happening here. It's not just a straight story of Squanto teaching these new colonists how to grow corn. There's a political structure happening, and on both sides trying to understand how to work together and how they're creating this new world coming about.